Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine you're an ancient historian, and your main source for one of the greatest voyages of all time is shorter than your average grocery list. That's pretty much the mystery of Hanno the Carthaginian.
It really is. I mean, Hanno's famous journey, the Periplus, it's absolutely foundational to understanding Carthage's reach into the Atlantic. But for anyone trying to study this, the real challenge isn't the trip itself. It's navigating this contested landscape of the sources we use to even prove it happened.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We're giving you the shortcut, the essential knowledge base. If you're going into the research for a paper, a project, whatever, you need to know which ancient text and which modern studies actually matter. We're decoding the bibliography for you.
Right, we're moving beyond just the summary of the trip. We're getting into the nuts and bolts of the scholarly debate. Hanno's voyage along the African coast is a perfect case study for how historians work. You have to combine these tiny fragments of text with huge amounts of geographical and archaeological data just to piece together a story.
So let's start at the beginning. The absolute foundation. The one source that everything else flows from. The Periplus of Hanno.
This is it. The primary essential reference. Without this document, Hanno's story is, well, it's practically a myth. And something you need to grasp right away is how it survived. Hanno was Punic, from Carthage, but the version we have today is a Greek translation.
And that matters hugely because
Because it immediately introduces a layer of interpretation and, possible error. We are not reading Hanno's original ship's log. We're reading a Hellenized version, maybe transcribed centuries later. So historians have to wrestle with translation issues, copying errors, maybe even a misinterpretation of Punic terms for places.
But the text itself, despite all that, it describes this incredible coastal journey down the African shores, a huge expedition. We know the Carthaginians were amazing sailors. Does this text just stand alone, or is there anything else from that time to back it up?
No, it doesn't stand completely alone, thankfully. Punic records are famously rare, but we do find signals, little mentions in other classical writers that confirm this voyage was a known event. If you're doing a deep dive, you want to look for references in Pliny the Elder and the geographer Strabo.
And what do Pliny and Strabo actually give us? Are they, providing details about the route?
Not specific route details, unfortunately. It's more about scale and confirmation. They provide context on Carthaginian sea power in general. Pliny, for example, helps establish their reputation for pushing beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Gibraltar. It grounds Hanno's voyage in a real historical context, so it's not just some sailor's tall tale.
So we have the Greek Periplus, the logbook fragment, and a couple of nods from Roman writers. But we have to talk about the main problem, the thing that fuels this whole debate. The text is just so incredibly short.
It's remarkably brief, and that brevity is the engine of the entire academic debate. If the text were long and detailed, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But because it's so ambiguous and so short, it forces researchers to look everywhere else, archaeology, oceanography, modern geography, to try and fill in the gaps.
Okay, so this is where the historical detective work really kicks in. The text is too short, so you can't stop there. You have to move into synthesis.
Right.
Using that fragment as a launch pad.
Exactly. You start doing comparative analysis. You compare the descriptions in the text of animals, people, land features against what we know from archaeology and geography about the West African coast. And that leads directly to the core scientific disagreement.
And that whole disagreement boils down to distance, doesn't it? It's all about how far south Hanno actually sailed.
Yeah.
So what are the two main arguments?
Right. There are two main camps, and both are pretty persuasive. Argument A says Hanno reached the Gulf of Guinea. We're talking a massive journey, maybe as far as modern Cameroon. That would just be an astonishing feat of logistics and colonization for Carthage.
Well, what's argument B?
Argument B is more conservative. It argues that the descriptions in the text can be matched perfectly with features much closer to home. So, Hanno might have stopped much further north, probably around the coasts of modern Morocco and Senegal.
Wow, so the difference between those two is thousands of miles. It completely changes how we think about Carthaginian power.
A fundamental difference.
Yeah. So what are some examples from the text that cause this problem? I mean, it must be frustrating that one description can point to two completely different places.
Oh, it is, but it's also what makes it so fascinating. A classic example is the description of the hairy men they encounter at the end.
Ah, the so-called gorillas. I've heard about this.
Exactly. If Hanno actually reached the Gulf of Guinea, well, those creatures could plausibly be gorillas. Their natural range matches that southern location. But if he only made it to Senegal, then they were more likely baboons or maybe chimpanzees. The animal's identity depends entirely on where you think he was.
And what about the geology? The burning mountain.
Same ambiguity. The text mentions volcanic activity, a chariot of the gods. If you argue for the southern route, that's often identified as Mount Cameroon, which is a massive volcano. But if you take the northern view, scholars link it to large seasonal brush fires or maybe even the Canary Islands, which would have been volcanically active and visible. The text just isn't specific enough to tell a brush fire from a volcano.
That really puts the challenge into focus.
Yeah.
If the text itself is that ambiguous, how do modern academics even begin to tackle it?
They start looking at intent and impact, not just the route. For example, some recent scholarship focuses on the cultural and religious consequences of these voyages. They ask questions like, what kind of religious artifacts might they have left? Did Carthaginian goods enter West African trade networks? Analyzing it through trade patterns gives you another tool, beyond just the sparse text.
So if you, the listener, are reading something that makes a definitive claim about how far Hanno went, you now know that source needs to bring some serious evidence. From zoology or geology or something else, because the periplus alone just can't support it.
That is the critical takeaway. The modern studies provide the tools. Without them, the ancient text is just an intriguing but ultimately an unprovable little story.
And that brings us perfectly to the modern analytical toolkit. Because the source is so short, researchers have to pull from this huge range of academic perspectives.
Yeah, the sheer volume of secondary material is a direct result of how little primary material we have. We need all these different studies for everything from, linguistics to scientific modeling.
Okay, let's break down a few essential references for anyone learning about this. For, say, historical context and a good translation, there's the Hindawi Foundation study.
That one is excellent. It provides the geopolitical stage setting. It focuses on what North Africa was like at the time, what colonization was already happening, what the known world looked like before Hanno even set sail. It helps you understand the why.
And for a more classic analysis, we have to mention the French perspective, like G. Rouget's Le Périple d'Hanno.
Right. Rouget's work is a classic. It's one of the early foundational French studies that first tried to systematically match the text's descriptions to specific points on a modern map. A lot of the modern debate really starts with these older studies.
And for the big picture view, to frame Hanno inside the larger history of Carthage's maritime power, there are books like B.H. Warmington's Carthage.
Warmington is crucial for perspective. You can't understand Hanno in a vacuum. His voyage wasn't just a trip for fun, it was a state-sponsored mission about trade, resources, and expansion. Warmington helps you see Hanno as part of a much larger strategic push.
Then we can shift to a more modern scientific take. Something like D.G. Lawrence's The Periplus of Hanno, A Voyage of Discovery.
Lawrence's work is so interesting because it's all about scientific verification. He uses modern geography, sailing knowledge, data on ocean currents, wind patterns, all of it. He tries to answer the practical question. Could an ancient ship actually have made it to the Gulf of Guinea? It applies a layer of real-world rigor to the story.
And we can't forget the perspectives from Arab historians, like Mohammed al-Talbi's work on Carthage.
Absolutely, that's a key point. This history doesn't just belong to one tradition. Historians from the Arab world bring expertise in North African history and medieval geography that can shed new light on the Carthaginian presence along the coast. It's a necessary check against a purely European-focused interpretation.
So what here is that all these different studies, from translation to science to imperial history, they build the scaffolding around this tiny, ambiguous original text. They give it the depth that's missing.
Exactly. That's the perfect way to put it. So if we connect all this back to the bigger picture for you, for the learner, what does this whole library of sources tell us about the best way to even approach studying Hanno?
What's the optimal methodology? What's the consensus among scholars?
Well, the advice is very clear. The best approach demands a synthesis of 3 distinct areas. You can't just rely on one to solve this ancient riddle.
Okay, lay them out for us. What are the 3 pillars?
First, you have the classical texts. That's the periplus itself, plus the corroborating bits from the Roman and Greek writers we talked about. That's your textual foundation. Second, you must bring in the archaeological studies, the physical evidence. We're talking artifacts, inscriptions, port remains, anything found along the African coast that can tangibly prove Carthaginians were there.
And the third leg of that stool?
The third is modern geographical analyses. Using maps, ocean currents, climate data, all work someone like Lawrence was doing to test if the journey described in the text is even feasible. It's a combination of text, artifacts, and maps.
And relating this back to you, the learner, Understanding those three pillars isn't just an academic exercise. It's
Ab-
empowering.
It truly is. If you read a book or watch a documentary that says definitively Hanno reached Cameroon, you now know how to assess that claim. You can ask, okay, where is your archaeological evidence? What geographical model supports that? Because you know the primary text alone is too weak to support such a strong conclusion. It helps you ask the right questions.
This has been a fantastic deep dive. We've established the Periplus of Hanno is the incredibly short but vital primary source. We get that its meaning is highly contested, driven by that debate over whether he reached the Gulf of Guinea or stopped near Senegal. And we know that to really understand it, you need this multifaceted approach combining text, artifacts, and modern geography.
It's a classic case where the uncertainty itself is what drives the scholarship forward.
So what does this all mean for the future of studying Hanno?
Well, since the textual evidence is so limited, and scholars have pretty much squeezed every possible meaning out of that Greek fragment, the definitive answer might not come from a library. It will probably rest on future archaeological discoveries along the African coast.
That's a powerful thought. The riddle gets solved with a shovel, not another book.
Yeah. Precisely. And that's the final thought for you to explore on your own. What would those findings even look like? A Carthaginian anchor found way down the coast. A pottery shard. The discovery of that one single piece of physical proof could settle a 2,000-year-old debate in an instant. And that would make the historian's job a lot easier and your journey as a learner much, much clearer.